Okay, so let's get into it now. Sort of your realm of expertise. When exactly did Abraham Lincoln meet Mary, and how did they get married?
Yeah, well, they met in Springfield, Illinois. Lincoln was, he was in his 30s at the time, kind of an older bachelor. Mary had moved there from Kentucky, was living with her sister and her brother-in-law, and they met at a dance. And Mary was the belle of the town. She was young, she was pretty, she was vivacious, she was rich. Her family was rich. She was extremely well educated. She had 12 years of schooling, more than most men did at the time. She could speak French, she could dance, she knew how to entertain. She was incredible. And everybody in town wanted her. She had so many suitors. She was literally batting them off with a stick. And Abraham Lincoln was a tall, uncouth guy from poverty in Kentucky. And, they met at a dance and they had many things in common. Both of them, their mothers died young. They both loved poetry. They both loved politics. They loved Whig politics. They loved literature. So they had a lot in common. And so, a lot of people didn't understand it. She would be marrying down. And of course, he's only using her to marry up in his social station. Personally, I think they really loved each other. That's a contention in the Lincoln film. Did they or did they not? I think they did, which wasn't a perfect marriage, but there's always ups and downs. So they had so much going against them that if they didn't love each other, they never would have gotten married.
Huh. So it seems that she was sort of a perfect political wife, judging by sort of her character. What did she think of Lincoln's political career? Did she fit into that role of the political wife?
She does, yeah. See, that's a fascinating question. One of the things about Mary that's fascinating. She does seem like the perfect political wife. She had vast ambition for him, and she helped him whenever she could. But helping back then is different from the way wives help, or spouses, I should say, help their partners today in politics. So for Mary, it was her role was she was a hostess if people came to the house. She was a supporter in private and in public. Her main contribution was that she was an excellent judge of character, whereas Abraham Lincoln typically only saw the good in people. And so, especially in the White House years, she would always try to warn him off. This guy's a snake. He's a snake. He's trying to undermine you. Don't give him a job. Whereas Lincoln, he wouldn't listen to her because he thought everybody was good or could be good. Um, and so, she had a huge impact on him. And there's many things that say that it was she believed in him, maybe even when he didn't believe in himself. She believed he could be a U.S. senator when he really didn't think he was any better than Congress. She believed he could be a president when he really believed, well, I don't think I can go any higher than a senator. So, but she didn't craft policy. She didn't write his speeches. She didn't do any of those things that happened today, which is one of the big misnomers. But a lot of people who knew Lincoln and historians afterward said that if he didn't marry Mary Lincoln, he never would have been president. Basically, the point being, if he had married a woman who was less ambitious, who had just made his home life warm and fuzzy and something that he never wanted to leave, to be a lawyer, to go politicking around the state, then maybe he wouldn't have tried so hard. I think it's a fair argument. I don't know if I agree. I mean, before he met Mary Lincoln, he taught himself to read, he taught himself the law, he taught himself the art of surveying. He got elected to the state legislature multiple times, all before he met her. So clearly that drive was there. And, as his law partner wrote a book, and in the book he said, Mr. Lincoln's political ambition was a little engine that knew no rest. And I think that sums it up exactly right. With or without Mary, that was his ambition.
Huh. That's interesting. I mean, I think it's a common thread with great men, great political leaders is having I don't think you can truly be a great man without a great woman there to lift you up. You know, I've heard a lot of married men say, "You never truly become a man. You never truly become whole until you have, a woman, a wife, a spouse, whatever." But it does seem to be a common thread among great men throughout history that they have a woman in their corner to lift them up. And it does seem to be a commonality where the husband, the man, whatever, sort of is that trusting figure. I'm referencing Reagan, obviously. I'm a member of YAF, so I feel particularly close to Reagan and know a little bit more about him than I do other presidents. But him and Nancy were the same way. Reagan was a very trusting man, and Nancy was always there, trusting no one, always speculating about the people around him. So that does seem to be a commonality.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've thought through the years there's actually some very interesting similarities between Mary Lincoln and Nancy Reagan and their relationships with their husbands, and then who their husbands were and how they were so able to relate to people. Nancy was into astrology. Mary Lincoln was into spiritualism. That's one of the big ones. It's kind of interesting.
That is interesting. So we say she's sort of a perfect political spouse, but when Lincoln's elected president, Mary is seen sort of as an outsider in Washington. No one really liked her as first lady. Why is that?
Yeah, that's so one of Mary's first and still one of the better biographers of Mary, Ruth Painter Randall. She wrote in her book, which is called Mary Lincoln Biography of a Marriage. She said Mary was perfectly fitted to be first lady, but once she got to Washington, she could not do anything right by the standards of those around her. So no matter how well fitted she was for it, she was going to fail. And I 100% agree with that. So she was, on paper, perfect as a political spouse, especially as the first lady. As I've already said, very intelligent. She could dance, entertain. She knew how to dress well. She knew how to, she redecorated the White House, which was a shabby bachelor's quarters under previous President Buchanan. She could talk French. She could talk politics. But there were two problems with her as first lady. Um, the first one, the simpler one, is that nobody accepted her. So when they got to Washington, so they were from Illinois, which at that time was, backcountry Hickville, more or less. So immediately, nobody in Washington respected them because they're not from Washington. They haven't lived here except for 2 years when Lincoln was in Congress. So they're just, Western hick rubes. They have no business being in Washington. So Northerners hated Mary. She was from Kentucky, which is a slave state. So they thought she was a Southern traitor. They didn't trust her. Southerners thought that she was a Northern traitor because she lived in Illinois, married a quote unquote black Republican. So all the Southerners hated her. And then all the Easterners, of course, as I said, they don't like Westerners. And then everybody in DC didn't like them because they're not part of the Beltway. Well, there wasn't a Beltway back then, but you know what I mean, of the interior. So nobody liked her. Nobody respected her. And Mary was a very strong-willed woman. So there's some great examples of, in various research I've done where, the women of Washington would come up to Mary at the White House and they would, if not give her advice, outright tell her what to do, how to do it. You're doing it wrong. And Mary was not the kind of person to just sit back and take it. She would basically say, didn't ask for your opinion. I'm the first lady. Who are you? Get out of my house. And so that just made things worse. So she couldn't win no matter what she did. I agree. But then, secondly, too, Mary did not have the emotional stability or temperament to be the first lady during the Civil War. If there was no war, she may have been one of the greatest first ladies ever. But she couldn't handle death. She couldn't handle the press just constantly criticizing her and her husband, the political enemies, the death threats against her husband, the stress of winning or losing the war. She couldn't handle those things emotionally or mentally in some cases. And so that didn't help either. So it's a fascinating thing to look at her. And then I think part of her mental illness goes into it as well because she, when she was first lady, she took bribes, she took payoffs for favors, among other illegal things she did. That's fact. That's established fact. And part of that was from she had delusions of poverty. And so she did these things because she felt like they needed the money. They were on, destitution's door. And if she didn't do this and get money, they wouldn't be able to afford to live. And part of it was a power trip. Part of it was because she was susceptible to flattery. If anybody flattered her, she would do whatever they wanted. So she's a very multifaceted, multi-layered individual, which is why I'm so fascinated by her. And I've done 5 books on her, and I'm working on number 6 right now. It's just she's very much like her husband. It not just it's not just who you see. There's a lot more to it, good and bad, that really shows who they were as a person, who they were in the White House, how that relates to the Civil War, even greater American history at the time.
That's so fascinating. Going back to what you said about Washington, D.C., seems that nothing's really changed in sort of the elitist establishment atmosphere of Washington, D.C. A lot of Republicans talk about drain the swamp, but this isn't a new thing. It's kind of permeated throughout American history. And say what you want about Trump. I think this is one of the reasons that a lot of people hate him is he's seen as an outsider. He wasn't a politician. He came on the scene as this, real estate TV guy, and all of a sudden he's the president. I think that's a reason a lot of people don't like him. And we're seeing that play out right now before our eyes with his cabinet picks. His cabinet picks are very unorthodox, a lot of outsiders, and I think he's purposely being disruptive.
I agree, absolutely. And I think one reason a lot of people vote for him is because he's not a politician. And so, because people are tired of politicians, even back then, even when talking about Lincoln, politician is a dirty word. And so when you apply that to Lincoln, a lot of people get upset. I'm like, oh no, he was a consummate politician. He knew how to play the game better than anybody, which is one reason so many senators and congressmen didn't like him because he outwitted them and he outsmarted them. But he's just supposed to be some Western hick rube from Illinois, but he was smarter than all of them. And so, and I agree. I think that's a very interesting comparison with him and Trump. Um, there's so many comparisons you can make. Like when W. Bush was running against John Kerry, it was so similar to Lincoln running against McClellan. It was, are we going to keep fighting the Civil War? Are we going to surrender? Bush Kerry was, are we going to keep fighting in Iraq? Are we just going to pull out and just leave a vacuum? I mean, that's a very basic comparison, but that was, I remember at the time thinking that was an interesting history repeating itself in a certain way.
Yeah, 100%. It's one of the biggest reasons we study history is to take the lessons of the past and apply them to the present or to the future. But, we talk about Mary Lincoln's inability to handle trauma. And a lot of people would think about the assassination on Abraham Lincoln and sort of how that affected her, but she had a lot of tragedy and trauma throughout her life prior to that. Can we talk about how many kids they had? Because I know some of the children they had died early, and that had a big impact on her.
It did, yeah. Mary had she had a lot of trials and tribulations in her life that impacted on her character, who she was. Some of it being mental illness, and some of it just being personality and character traits. One of my favorite books about Mary Lincoln is actually not even about Mary Lincoln. It's called House of Abraham Lincoln and the Todd Family, and it's about Abraham Lincoln's relationship with Mary's family. She was one of was it I think 14 brothers and sisters. Half were from her mother. Her mother died in childbirth. Her father remarried, and then he had 8 more kids or so afterward. And so it's about Lincoln's relationship with these people, this rich aristocratic family, and how they helped him or hindered him in his career. But what that book showed me was how Mary Lincoln grew up and what kind of family space she grew up. And the book is does a great job explaining how. So they had this house with 14 kids, not necessarily all at once because of age ranges, but there was parents, there was slaves. They had a lot of slaves. Back in the day, if someone came to visit, they'd stay for a month or two. You'd have family who lived not far away coming to stay for a few days. Her father was a banker and a politician. His office was in the house. So you've got people. So it's just this big roiling cauldron of people constantly, most of them being children. And so Mary always had to be the center of attention as an older person. Why is that? Well, when she was a child in a house like that, how do you get any attention? by making people notice you. So that, that's just a basic example of why she was the way she was personality wise. So, that's, I find a very interesting thing as far as her personality. She could be, one reason I think it was bipolar, she could be loving and wonderful and kind and generous one minute. And then in the blink of an eye, she would be just vicious and mean and self centered. And some of that was bipolar. Some of that was, that's the way her family is. I mean, when you read about the Todd family, you read some letters from her brothers and sisters, they were all like that. There's a quote somewhere that said Mary was just like her family because the Todds were all good haters, which is how she was. And that's her son Robert was a good hater as well later in his life. And so, there's a lot of family things that come in when we read about people, historical figures, sometimes we forget about the context in which they grew up and lived and worked and did whatever they did, because you're surrounded by people all the time. And so, her family definitely had a huge impact on Mary, and why she was who she was.
Hmm. That's interesting. So she had to. A lot of women do this. She had to sort of put herself out there and be this animated, larger than life figure in order to get attention in a bustling household. Do you think that I'm just kind of brainstorming here, but do you think that she sort of put on this personality, this facade to get attention, and then it sort of consumed her, and she became that uh greedy for attention type of figure to sort of lash out and do these crazy things just to get attention?
Yeah, I think she definitely needed attention. That's one reason why, as I said, when she was first lady, anyone who flattered her would get anything they wanted from her. Whether it was just by words or whether they gave her presents or things. She loved attention. But, like in Springfield, before she was married, when she was married, Mary would be the one, almost like kind of like a movie, maybe not a bad movie, but there's a room full of people, but there's that one woman who's dressed a little nicer, who has the fan going a little faster, whose laugh is just a little bit louder. And yes, she's beautiful and she's intelligent, and but she's making everyone look at her. And I that's how I see Mary. And I don't know that that necessarily has to be a negative thing, but that's exactly the way I think she was, which is why so many men courted her when she was younger. But then, I do think part of that was affectation, especially as first lady. She grew up in the aristocracy. Then she married down to Lincoln, who was lower middle class when they married. By the time they get to the White House, he was upper middle class, very successful lawyer. But they weren't rich by any means. And so when they went to the White House, Mary suddenly was back in the aristocracy, even above the aristocracy. And so she thought of herself as a queen, and she acted like a queen. She expected everyone to treat her as a queen and give her anything she wanted. And so I think part of her affectations were acting in that regal manner, which there's letters and diaries from many people throughout the Civil War talking about the way she acted or didn't act and how ridiculous it was.
Yeah, I didn't really pick up on this when doing my research prior to this conversation, but I do think, now that I think about it, that it I mean, she definitely had the mental illnesses you talk about, but I think it could have been an act to, because she had that void for attention, in her heart, and I think it could have been sort of an act in order to get any attention whatsoever, because she did have that hunger for attention. But going back to the kids,
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to talk
how
about the
many
kids. Yeah.
no, it's all no, it's all good. So how many kids did she have, and what was her relationship with them? How many of them died early?
Yeah, so the Lincolns had four children. Robert was the oldest, and then they had their second son was Eddie. Eddie died in 1850, just before his fourth birthday, from what was probably tuberculosis, and which just destroyed, as it would destroy any parent, but it destroyed Mary. One of the first big major moments of her life. And right around the same time that Eddie died, Mary's father died and her grandmother died, all in the same time, within a matter of months. So shortly after Eddie died, then they had Willie Lincoln, and then 3 years later came Tad, their youngest. So there were ultimately three children. Eddie died so young. And then Willie died in the White House when he was 11 from typhoid fever from bad drinking water. And then Tad died when he was 17 years old in 1871 after the assassination. So Robert was the only Lincoln child to grow to adulthood. But the relationships are interesting because so Willie and Tad were like best friends playing together in Springfield and in the White House. There's lots of articles and books and things about them. Robert, his playmate would have been Eddie, but Eddie died, and so Robert was incredibly close to Mary, and almost like they were best friends. Because remember, Lincoln was gone 6 to 9 months a year, riding the circuit or doing politics or just being in the law office. So
Running the country.
right, so Robert and Mary were incredibly close. And that was that way all the way up until Robert had his mother committed to the sanitarium in 1875. And so, the Lincolns as parents is interesting. I think if I had met them, I would have hated them as a parent myself. They let their children do anything, literally. Their was it Lincoln used to say, I'm happy that my children are free and unencumbered by parental tyranny. Love is the chain whereby to bind a child to its parents. I think that's the quote. But literally, he could do anything. And so the kids could do anything. And so, like William Herndon, Lincoln's law partner, would write about it. He'd say, Willie and Tad would come to the office and they would, overturn chairs and spill ink pens and tear up papers and destroy the office. And Mr. Lincoln would just sit there, not even noticing. Or if he did notice, he would just laugh, thinking it's a great joke. Whereas Herndon wanted to smack the kids and kick them out of the office. And that's how they were in the White House as well. And, people who met them were just like, I can't believe his kids are such horrible monsters. So that's interesting. That's another thing about him, is that freedom or is that lack of any kind of laws or restrictions at all? Which one's better,
Yeah, I think that would also, frustrate me very much. I'm not a parent, but that I don't envision that to be my sort of parenting and governing style. So Robert is the only one to survive to adulthood. 3 of the 4 children die relatively early, and, you know, 2 of these are prior to Lincoln's assassination, right? Okay, so is this where Mary really starts to unravel?
Well, there's different theories. A lot of people then and now think that the assassination pushed Mary over the edge, that she was never totally stable. But the assassination, she was holding her husband's hand when he got shot in the head, leaning on him. So how horrible would that be? Robert Lincoln, the oldest son, he always believed it was the assassination that unhinged her. Some people then and now think it was the death of Willie. So Willie, as parents, none of us have favorite children, but of course we all do. And Willie was the favorite parent, the favorite child of both Lincolns. And when he died, they were just devastated. And so some people think it was Willie's death that pushed her over the edge. Personally, I think that it was Tad's death in 1871 that really pushed her over the final edge. If you think about it back then, a lot of people, a lot of women lost far more children than Mary did, lost multiple husbands because of disease and whatnot. And they could all handle it just fine, in a normal amount of grief. But, Mary, if you look back all the way to her childhood, she had mental issues. She was up and down, up and down. So, she'd be doing fine. Then Eddie died and she went down. Then she got better. And then Willie died and she went farther down. Then she got better. And then her husband died. And then finally she was starting to come out of it. And so Abraham Lincoln was really her pillar, I think, to sanity. And, she said in one letter, she said, he was from my 18th year, husband, lover, father, brother, all to me, truly my all. And when he died, there was a huge void there. So she immediately clung on to Tad. Because Robert, by this time, shortly after the assassination, he started working in a law firm. He got married. He had kids. He had a life. And Mary just, she barely ever let Tad out of her sight, quite frankly. And she had very few friends. She didn't speak to family because she treated everybody so badly during the White House years that nobody wanted to talk to her. So all she had was Tad. And so when he died, she had nobody because Robert was a grown up. And quite frankly, when you read his letters and things, you can see some exasperation creeping in. He's like, I've got a job and a wife and kids and a house and all this stuff. And mother, come on, give me a break. You can tell that. So when she wants a lot of attention, he's not necessarily giving it to her for various reasons. So, and it's really, it was 1875 where Robert had her committed, but she had signs long before that. So, that's my take, is that Tad is what pushed her over the edge. But, when she was committed in 1875, um, all the newspapers, all the people, everybody, if you read anything about it at the time, almost to a person, they all said the same thing. Like, oh yeah, that figures. I'm surprised she didn't go crazy 10 years ago. So yeah, it was not a surprise to anybody.
It's so tragic. I mean, it's hard to look back in hindsight and blame any of them for the way they reacted to the situation. I mean, if you lose, I mean, three of your four children, your husband gets assassinated right next to you. I mean, that would drive anyone crazy. It's really easy to empathize with them here. And in terms of Robert, like, he's got a life of his own, a wife, children, a job, and he's got this crazy mom. It's a lot to deal with. It's really emotionally draining. So I mean, you really it's just so tragic. I mean, because we can't imagine anyone can't imagine what that would feel like to have that level of tragedy and trauma in your life.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that's part of just understanding. Like, I agree with you. Yeah, you can't blame her for what she did, and actually, when you understand that she had mental illness, a lot of her bizarre behaviors actually make more sense and make her more understandable. And when you understand that Robert at the time was a Victorian gentleman, head of the household, if he didn't protect his mother, he failed as a man. Then that also makes you understand a little bit more why he did what he did. So yeah, that's, as a historian, that's what I always try to do, is just to understand and not cast blame, which is where you get a lot of misinterpretation, especially with Mary Lincoln. Is this is the biggest one, is her mental status.
Yeah, I think empathy is one of the most important traits that you can have as a historian. But let's speak to the being committed to the insane asylum, Ballou Place Sanitarium, right?
Bellevue.
Bellevue. Okay, apologies. So you say she's Robert commits her in 1875. What is the process there?
So that's so the law had only changed a couple of years before this happened. So previously in Illinois, a man could commit a woman or a child to a mental institution merely on his say so. She's crazy, lock her up. And that's all it took. Then there was a woman who, I'm blanking on her name right now, but basically her husband locked her up. He was, I don't remember. It's like something like he was a Baptist and she was a Presbyterian. And so she disagreed with him on something on the grounds of religion. And he said, yeah, no, you're crazy. And he got a doctor, and the doctor said, yeah, she's crazy. And they locked her up in an asylum for years. And she ultimately fought her way out. She fought, and she got the law changed. And so by the time of Mary's trial, because she had to go to trial, the law was a little different. So at the time, Robert couldn't just say, yeah, she's crazy, lock her up. So he consulted with 7 medical experts and 3 of his father's closest friends, and told them all. Some of the doctors had treated her, some of them hadn't. They only knew what Robert told them and what Lincoln's friends of 30, 40 years had told him. And so then they went to trial. She had to be arrested and brought to court, although um, Lincoln's friend Leonard Swett, he persuaded her to come to court rather than be arrested and put in handcuffs. And then there was a trial, and Mary had a lawyer. Robert had a lawyer. He had a couple lawyers, and they argued the case. The jury had to be it had to be a jury trial, and at least one of the jurors had to be a medical doctor. And so after 2 hours of testimony, the jury took I think it was less than 10 minutes to find her. That at the time, they didn't have a lot of different words. It was just she is insane. So at the time they could have just put her in a state asylum, which is kind of like a one flew over the cuckoo's nest kind of horrible, horrible place nobody should ever go. Of course, Robert didn't allow that to happen. He had her put in a private asylum that was, it had um, modern facilities. It was a big, beautiful house, and there was no medication or anything. It was moral therapy. So there was talking, there was walking and exercising and tending to it was world class rose gardens, and Mary could go in for carriage rides and things like that. So it was not a horrible place at all. I tend to explain it sometimes as like probably when Hollywood starlets go for drug treatment, kind of something like that, almost like a resort in a way. So Mary was supposed to be there for 1 year, and then after that, they could revisit her case. And after 4 months, she was allowed to go live with her sister in Springfield, Illinois, instead of staying at the sanitarium. But she was still under court order of insanity, but she was just staying there because she made this big public clamor about it, saying, I'm not crazy. The doctor finally said, I can't treat her anymore. So let her go there with a nurse. And so 1 year later, um, they went back to court, and the court pronounced her restored to reason. And Mary immediately fled to Europe because she was afraid that Robert would try to have her committed again. And they didn't speak for about 5 years. There's a lot more to it than that. Those are just the high points. But
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, this is where, because they were close before this, right?
oh, they were incredibly close. And if you read Mary's letters, after the assassination, Mary constantly gives Robert the highest praise she ever could or would give anyone. She would say, you know, dear Robert grows more and more every day like his sainted father. But part of Mary's mental illness was she had a delusions of poverty and delusions about money. And she thought Robert was trying to steal her money, which he wasn't, but she thought he was. And so Robert was afraid in all of her symptoms, not only afraid for her life, which the doctors warned him about, but he was also afraid for her financial well-being and her ability to live on her own, because she just spent it constantly, and he was afraid she would bankrupt herself, which again would then be his fault because he, as the man of the family, is not protecting her. And so one reason he had her committed was that he was put in charge of her money, so she couldn't spend it all. And he didn't spend any of it, but she thought he wanted to steal it. So that was a big part of the insanity period, was an argument over money.
Yeah, so their relationship completely collapses and deteriorates. But if you ever want to sort of visit a dark aspect of history, look up the way that people were treated in terms of insane back in the day. I mean, the conditions of insane asylums and the way and the ease people were committed with. I mean, people with mild, what today would be considered like mild psychological disorders or illnesses, would just instantly be sent to these horrid, horrific, inhumane, insane asylums.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've read a lot of articles in the Journal of American Insanity, which is not a title that would survive today. But yeah, to read articles back then about how they looked, how they viewed disease, how they treated disease, it's pretty fascinating. Some of it was pretty intelligent and elevated from my layman's standpoint. Some of it seemed rather dark ages. So